everyone, and good afternoon, Steve. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It is a great pleasure to have you here in Braga at Index Media Art. And it's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to talk with you. Before start the conversation, allow me to say some words about your theoretical and artistic work. Steve Goodman is a DJ, an electronic music producer, a multidisciplinary artist, a writer, professor, former professor. No, professor, yeah.
Recovered academic.
Okay. Okay, and operating as Code 9, Steve Goodman is the founder and driving force behind the era-defining hyperdub label that launched and released music by the likes of Burial, Lee Gamble, Fatima Al-Qadiri, Klein Nazar, Laurel Ayler, DJ Rashad, and many others. And more recently, he founded the sublabel Flatlines to focus on audio essays and sonic fictions. And the first release was on Vanishing Land, an audio essay by Mark Fisher and Justin Barton. In his known name, Steve Goodman published, for me, the seminal Sonic Warfare, Sound, Effect, and the Ecology of Fear, the MIT Press in 2010, and is the co-editor of Sound and Death, published by Urbanomic in 2019. And Steve Goodman is as well a former member of CRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, an experimental and idiosyncratic cultural theorist collective that explored and crossed post-structuralism, cybernetic, science fiction, rave culture, occult studies, and much more exoteric subject, I think. And coming back to Code 9 Alias, you released these two sound objects in 2020, the Escapology and the audio essay Astrodarian, or must I say this documentary fiction in sound narrated by Scottish AI voices. That at the same time is the original soundtrack to imaginary video game. Escapology and Astrodarian are what we can call speculative exercises that seek to connect two moments in history. The Darien scheme in the 17th century, that was the unsuccessful attempt of Scotland to colonize part of what is now Panama, and the project today in Scotland of two spaceports for launching satellites with future plans to send tourists to space, and this space race involves local communities, the UK Space Agency, the defense industry, a Danish billionaire, Extinction Rebellion, and millions of government and private investment. Steve, before we delve deeper into how these two events are historically related, I'd like to start with a more straightforward question. What is a sonic fiction? And what is a sonic fiction in terms of what is visual fiction or a verbal fiction, but because we are more familiar with those kind of fictions.
Thanks for that introduction. To be as simple about it as possible, a sonic fiction, the phrase sonic fiction was coined by the writer Cujo in a book More Brilliant Than the Sun in the late 90s, 97, 98, to describe the way in which particularly musicians of a black electronic or black Atlantean tradition, so a lineage that runs from Sun Ra through Lee Scratch Perry, Detroit techno, up to jungle, where the book was in the 90s, to theorize themselves, to theorize music, to theorize, conceptualize through their music. And creating what he calls myth sciences. And the most potent example of that from this lineage is a Detroit electro group called Drexciya, who have a sonic fiction which describes a narrative to do with the Middle Passage from the forced migration of slaves from West Africa to North America, and that during the Middle Passage, some slaves were thrown overboard, and these slaves mutated into these kind of underwater seafaring creatures. They created the whole myth of Drexciya, a kind of Black Atlantis myth. And this kind of sonic mythology surrounds their music. So it creates a world, it's kind of world building into which their music is placed. So that's the specific origin of this concept of sonic fiction. So it's not just, so how that world building takes place is through sound, but also through art, through the record sleeves, through the track titles, through the images on the labels of the record. So it's all of the sonic work, all of the visual and conceptual, linguistic, and sonic material that goes into world building and into which their music inhabits or populates this world. So that's the specific origin of that term, which marks it out immediately. It's different from just the fiction in sound or the history of radio fiction, or, you know, this idea of sonic fiction's got a very specific definition and origin. At the same time, it's quite open. It's a very open definition. So I this is a question that came up with myself when I was developing these projects. Like, it's mostly a concept that's created for instrumental music without words. So most obviously storytelling usually takes place in language, or in spoken word or in text. So one question with this project was adding this more conventional mode of narration through words into this kind of sonic world building.
Yes, and maybe we can talk a little about Afrofuturism, because maybe it's a reference here. Yeah. Even the theme of those sonic objects are not Afro people, but in some ways coloniality and imperialism. And allow me to return to Mark Derry's text from '94, which is the text in the concept is coined. And he says that, I quote, "Can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of history, imagine possible futures? Furthermore, isn't the unreal state of the future already owned by technocrats, futurologists, streamliners, and set designers, white to a man, who have engineered our collective fantasies?" And Kodwe Shun writes 10 years later, in 2003, in further considerations on Afrofuturism, that what is at stake in Afrofuturism is some ways of engineering feedback between its preferred future and its becoming present. And here we have some kind of recursivity between past and future and present, and we don't have the linear and cumulative way of see history. I think that those notions are important to your exercise around Escapology and Astro Darien, right?
Yeah, very much so. I think before I answer that, if we could put this laptop on the images on the screen, please. Thanks. This is why we called this session Sonic Time Spirals. Because one thing that we learned from Afrofuturism alongside other alternative approaches to temporality is an approach to history that's no longer this kind of linear, or a type of futurism, a type of approach to technology and futurism, which isn't a linear path, unidirectional, with a specific epoch that reaches an equilibrium point that might be the progress of Western civilization, for example. So it's got this recursive, like I said, feedback process is often cyclical. I prefer this idea of a time spiral as opposed to time cycles. And without going too deep into that, this is something that as a DJ, I was always struck by rhythmically in music of what Cujo would call Black Atlantic futurism. In other words, there's a number of ways to describe it rhythmically. Cyclic discontinuity is one way. And this kind of repetition and this relationship between repetition and difference. Anyway, the way this plays out in Astrodarian is the narrative starts in the present but is interested in spiraling, so it spirals around the present into the future and into the past. And what brackets this historical time spiral is these two moments, one historical and one speculative, that mark the beginning and the end of the UK, the beginning and the end of the United Kingdom.
Post-Brexit historical frame.
Yeah, this is the speculative dimension. Brexit taken to its logical conclusion, which would be the UK decides to leave Europe and Scotland decides to leave England. So, the beginning and the end of the UK. So, like you mentioned in the introduction, the Darien scheme, what I refer to as a Caledonian heart of darkness, which was a catastrophic event, a catastrophic attempt to colonize Panama. It was such a disaster, it almost bankrupted Scotland and led to a kind of dependency relationship between Scotland and England and the Act of Union of 1707. So basically the birth of the union between Scotland and England, and therefore opening the way for the intensification of the British Empire, the intensification of slavery from West Africa, British colonization of the Caribbean. Scotland had a very large presence in Jamaica, for example, running plantations and so on. So it opens the way for the British Empire in its darkest dimensions, but also in its just economic growth and the economic dependency of money made through the empire, of a lot of British institutions, Scottish institutions, and so on. So that's the historical dimension of this time spiral. The speculative dimension emerges from a number of events, some of which are recent history and some of which are speculative. The failed Scottish independence referendum of 2014, Brexit, the pandemic, and then this future-facing direction, which kind of is an extrapolation from what you refer to as the space race, which is going on in the Highlands of Scotland just now, to build these two spaceports. Neither of them exists yet. So even their existence
it's
their future existence is haunting these
Already
empty
the
moorlands just now. They've just started building them in the last year. Their aim, I found this out during the pandemic, kind of bored, stuck in my flat, that there's actually a very vibrant satellite industry in Glasgow, in Scotland. So the main real function of these spaceports is to launch satellites to be used for climate monitoring and probably some military defense aspects to it as well, especially the one that they're proposing in the Shetland Islands. So an extrapolation of this, of like, okay, it's probably more likely that Scotland will get independence in a science fictional mode by escaping to an orbital space habitat than in the short term politically. So there's the time spiral around the present, spiraling off between the future and the past. And so all this is framed in the project as a video game for the PlayStation 9, which also doesn't yet exist. That's the logo for it there in the corner. And Grand Theft Auto was originated from a games production company called Rockstar Games North, which is a Scottish video game company. Came out of a video game production university degree in Dundee, and then I think they set up offices in Edinburgh. So part of the speculation is, what would they, if they weren't simulating American street life, what would they make as a game if they made a game about the breakup of Britain? Made a game about the disintegration of the UK. And so that's what Asteroid Aryan is. It's a video game. The game designer in this fictional universe is a Scottish Panamanian. So she is working with this game engine AI to run, using a predictive AI, run different simulation models of different outcomes of in the way in which the disintegration of the UK will unravel or take place or unfold. And one of them is this exodus to orbital space habitat. So it kind of, I suppose it's asking the question of, okay, another thing that comes from astrofuturism is this idea that most science fiction about the future, about space colonization and so on, is merely, is really talking about historical colonization. So it's with that in mind, it asks the question of like, well, if you're gonna create what are the issues if you're gonna create this kind of speculative space habitat? Okay, there's no one there you're not taking someone's land, but there's a whole series of economic factors involved. There's a whole question about how you relate to aliens. Another key trope of science fiction, and Afrofuturism obviously does something really interesting with the concept of the alien. In other words, it tends to identify with the alien as opposed to be the human versus the alien, which you get in a lot of historical science fiction. Often Afrofuturism identifies with the alien. So it raises the question of the alien when you have a space habitat. It extrapolates forward what the Darien scheme was supposed to be doing, which was to set up a trading post. It was to take Panama as a way of a trading post between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. So a space trading post. Sorry, I'm just rambling now.
Yeah, but you said somewhere that this kind of exercise can reverse the mistakes, and this notion of reverse or repair the mistakes and the crimes of the UK.
Well, what the games programmer, one thing she's trying to do is program into this AI a set of parameters which, even though the AI is kind of generating these different potential outcomes, there's an attempt to factor in the debts and liabilities that that the UK was based on. So the disintegration and exodus and escape needs to take account of, it's not starting from a clean slate. It needs to take account of this kind of imbalanced balance sheet or accounts.
Because in Afrofutourism is always that idea of escape routes. You mentioned that in Sonic Warfare, and this is an idea, again, from Kodo Eshun, of like the frequencies and the sounds that functions and are engineered as escape routes to some kind of real-world environments that are already alien to the people that are constantly displaced. And if we think about some imperialist moments in history, we can see very well that notion of displaced peoples. And here we have some escaping routes from UK to Panama, but as well escaping routes from Scotland to space, imperialist colonies in 17th century and space colonies now. So in some way there are some kind of possible correspondences, but in a certain way it's completely different, right?
Yeah, I suppose, again, this goes back to the idea of the spiral. Like you could say, take the present and then the historical facing part of this story and the future facing, and they're not symmetrical. The space colonization, well, if it's interesting at all, it's that it's not merely a reflection of the past. It's not, well, this is the question, is it an escape or is it, are you stuck in a loop? If you're stuck in a loop, then the space colony, it's going to be a space colony which is merely reiterating the mistakes of the past. And obviously, these... So this model of space habitat, it's called the Stanford Torus, which was developed in a NASA conference for artists and engineers in the mid-70s, where they were like imagining complete overpopulation of the planet. How's humanity going to survive? They're going to try and colonize space. So they got lots of artists involved to like imagine models for space habitation. And so this is one of them. There's others, cylinders, shapes, and so on. The way these models are usually proposed is by billionaires like Elon Musk. I don't know if anyone's seen the film Elysium, which is a Stanford Torus model. It's basically like Beverly Hills in space. So it's usually an escape route for the 1%, these kind of projections of these space habitats. So a projection of the richest areas for the richest strata of society to escape a blighted planet that's climate change, nuclear catastrophe, and so on. The escape to this
oasis,
10-star hotel in the sky, in space. So, if in a way this would be, if this was just merely a reflection of the idea of colonization, then it would be that. So part of what is being experimented with here is the idea of an inverse Elysium, in which the elite are stuck on the planet because they're so wedded to the United Kingdom, and everyone else escapes to. I mean, this is like a pandemic fever dream. I'm stuck in my flat playing video games, imagining getting out.
But you said that escapology is not escapism, right? It's maybe we start thinking about how the transhumanist narrative also talks about this renewed dream of living Earth, and there is a thin line, right, between sometimes escapology and escapism, the escaping roots of Afrofuturism, and the techno exodus of Earth.
Yeah.
By the
It's definitely playing with some of these traits. That line, there's a line which is also in the live performance tomorrow night, which relates to the difference between escapism and escapology. And this line comes from an article from Benedict Singleton, from a book called The Accelerationism Reader.
Jailbreak something, right?
Maximum Jailbreak.
Maximum
so
Jailbreak,
it's really an
yeah.
article about Russian cosmism.
Yes.
So what it's trying to do is take seriously these grand projects, grand engineering projects for the future of humanity. In other words, going against this kind of small-scale degrowth mentality to see if there's something worth preserving about these big design engineering projects, which are obviously very important. Without these kind of projects, we wouldn't even know about climate change on a global scale, without this kind of global view. So the escapology, not escapism thing, I'm kind of playing with in a few different ways. One, to like speculate about a Caledonian cosmism, which obviously doesn't exist, except in this project.
Because at the same time, Sandra, for instance, is in a very cosmological way.
Yeah, it's also to put these things in a much more cosmological context. One way in philosophy that people are talking about different non-Western approaches to technology, different non-Western futurisms as cosmotechnics. Yeah, every culture has a cosmotechnics, which is a kind of a way of spiraling between ancient knowledge and technology. It doesn't see, again, it escapes this kind of linear notion of history in which folk knowledge, let's say, is left in the past, and technology reason takes us away from that. It's more what the music journalist Simon Reynolds, the way he describes a music like jungle, he calls it roots and futurism. So it's a spiraling between the past and the future.
That needs a techno diversity in terms of like biodiversity, but needs a techno diversity. And maybe we can think that a lot of the Black Atlantic futurism producers work with those techno diversity in samplers, turntables, like non-proposed use of technology, and that's a way of using the medium to speculate. No, I'm not sure if that question makes sense, but
yes.
Okay. No, because you say that you for instance, you like to play fast music, like footwork, like jungle, and the question of tempo is not a neutral thing in that aesthetics, but at the same time an ethics of playing music. Do you think that you are in the same speculative movement of this spiral and non-linear timelines?
In my musical practice?
Yes.
Well, just to relate it back to this project, it's not a project about music. It's, it uses sound and music and so on to do this world building and tell this story. But so that's the Astrodarian part of the project. The other part of the project, which is the live performance tomorrow night, Escapology. Musically, that's, I suppose, a bit closer to what I do normally as a producer and as a DJ. And so in this world, this more upbeat, more rhythmic version of the story plays the role of the action scenes within this fictional game. What is going on in these action scenes? Well, I don't really know. There's some hint of it in the live set, but this is kind of part of the story which needs fleshing out. Going on to your more general question about what's your more general question about music? This is interesting because I'm not usually, when I talk about this project, it's an escape for me talking about
because
music as such. So it's interesting how or if they come together, in what way they come together.
Yeah, because another quote by Kodo Eshun is that the recording medium acts as an interface between science and myth. And in this sense, every medium opens some kind of a continuum from technology to myth, and to myth coming back to technology. And this notion of, or this purpose of use technology against this intended purpose and introducing error and glitch and fail and other tempos, non-usual tempos in music, in some way could be like a kind of cultural hacking, I don't know, but kind of forcing, maybe not I can't say the word, the accelerationist aesthetics. Because I think that the medium is not neutral here. And so my question is towards that role of medium in this piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think apart from all the paraphernalia that surrounds the music, which constitutes sonic fiction and world building and so on, I think one of the many things that I share with Kojo's ideas, More Brilliant Than the Sun, is the way in which these musics that we're talking about, these kind of activate rhythmic intelligences. In other words, they operate through the body and they activate the body technology interface, and create these sonic worlds through that interface. In other words, the kind of immanent world building as opposed to transcendent world building. And I don't know, I could ramble about this for ages, but I'm just trying to understand the specific point you're making.
No, the specific point is like, well, we know that, as McLuhan said, the medium is the message. So how, because Escapology has this club dimension with strong beats and no words, and Astrodarian is more sound design with words, and there is a criteria to make those different sound objects, right? That uses different techniques in. So my question is about that, the specificity of the medium that are implied in Astrodarian and Escapology.
The process of making them is something I never discuss in public.
You don't have
completely random, I'd say, it's the process. So sonically, this project came from a commission to produce a sound piece for a 50-speaker sound system called the Acousmonium at GRM in Paris, something that got cancelled because of the pandemic. So it started as an instrumental piece with me making lots of very specific, almost insectile sounds that would sound good whizzing around a surround sound system. And it literally involved me just banging my keyboards and equipment to try and make these sounds in a way that I'd never made music before. Completely off the grid and trying to use the software, trying to activate the accidents in the software. Pandemic happened, the stories started to emerge out of this mass of very arbitrary, random sound. The story emerged, the story became vocalized using text-to-speech of Scottish voices. So that all kind of happened in a very bottom-up kind of way, which is the other aspect of sonic fiction, which is interesting, where you create a world starting with sound, not images. Anyway, so once that had taken shape, I'd never made sound like that before, so I was very struck by how different it sounded and wanted to take that to the next step of being able to perform it. And so the Escapology version is me making club tracks out of this kind of massive sound that emerged out of trying to make a surround sound piece. I don't really talk about my process because I don't think it's particularly interesting.
You don't have to.
Which is why I find this question quite difficult.
Okay, maybe come back to a final part. Maybe come back to the question about futurability. And now we live in a time that the engines of the future are, well, they have been taken over by finance, by the notion of the market, the notion of predictability, management, everything to deliver reliable futures and mathematized futures, I think. We know that the future in a lot of times appears like the terrain of the capitalist evolution and expansion. Do you think that it's important to make counter apparatus to this kind of predictability, to invert this kind of closed futurability?
Obviously, I'm interested in this project's interested in some kind of counter future. And the historical dimension of this project is, it's really the origin of a lot of very intense financial institutions of the UK, the Bank of England and the Royal Bank of Scotland. The guy who proposed the Darien scheme was one of the founders of the Bank of England, and the Royal Bank of Scotland was set up to deal with this debt that Scotland had to England. The Royal Bank of Scotland was kind of set up to administer this new relationship of the Union. Now, in the science fictional dimension of this story, that's why the story is basically told through the game designer and her relationship with the game engine, the AI of the game engine, which is, engaged in these predictive simulations. And I suppose the question is it going to just repeat the future mistakes of colonization. Is space colonization just merely going to repeat these mistakes? Or is it going to throw up something genuinely, with a genuine escapological dimension to it? That's the hanging question of the project, I suppose. And I suppose it's relying on this relationship between a designer and an AI. And how
and
they...
human and non-human.
Sorry?
And human and non-human in a certain way.
Yeah, or what that system is between the human and the non-human. Whether that can produce something that is beyond what either of them could have produced on their own, and whether that's a line of flight or leads to this kind of recursive, stuck in a loop dimension. I suppose that's the ultimate question of the project. There should be sequels, really, to explore this question.
Maybe a last question about this notion of failed projects. And Mark Fisher says that in the reverse of an utopia, there is always the failure of the future that will be not actualized, and we will have just nostalgia. Do you think that there is a cybernetic futurism in here, but at the same time, can we think about those lost futures, the colonial lost futures, the techno lost futures, I don't know.
I mean, I don't see this as a hauntological project in that way, that hauntology has lost, exploring futures that got shut down or lost. I think it's more about, rather than being haunted by lost futures, by the way in which this area in the north of Scotland is haunted by a future that's about to happen. I mean, I'm not sure how this project fits in with all that, but I'd say it's the closest I've come to like doing something almost utopian, or it flirts with utopia in a way I've never done before. The scenario is deeply dystopian. Why this all happens, it's not spelled out, but it's deeply dystopian, obviously. But the idea of this kind of fully automated space habitat, which escapes the woes of the planet, using this kind of egalitarian, full automation, post-scarcity model, is definitely the closest I've come to doing a project that's got some relation to utopia. I think after I wrote this project, I came across all of this. I'm not a space opera fan. I've never been into science fiction of space. The closest what got me interested in that was the way it was done in dance music, whether it be Detroit techno or drum and bass, a guy called Gerald or Drexia, or this. Anyway, after this project, I discovered this strand of Scottish science fiction, which because the political
literature written,
yeah. Most famously Ian Banks, although Ian Banks doesn't write about Scotland as such, but there's writers like Ken MacLeod, and for the same reason that Scottish independence is a prospect, Scottish science fiction tends to have this much more socialist outlook than Anglo-American, a lot of Anglo-American science fiction. So I came across this thread of like libertarian socialist space habitation science fiction, Ken MacLeod, and different different stories of like UFOs in the Highlands of Scotland. There's obviously a big shipbuilding, a history of shipbuilding industry in the west coast of Scotland and Glasgow, and there's a bunch of science fiction which treats these locations as spaceship building locations. And there's a lot of nuclear submarines in that area, and they're in a lot of this science fiction. They're converted into faster than light spaceships and so on. So this project kind of led me towards this weird strand of Scottish speculative fiction that had been attempting to derealize Scottish history. In other words, alienate Scottish history from itself and imagine these slightly surreal extrapolations and escape routes, which paralleled the Afrofuturism stuff in an interesting way, although what none of them deal with is Scotland's legacy in empire and the way that that has to inflect any kind of projection forward of Scottish science fiction. I think there's one recent book by Ken MacLeod, Beyond the Hallowed Sky, which also mentions Darien in terms of colonizing another planet, but it does it in a quite different way from the way it takes place in this. So to go back to your question, I think it's more about being haunted by the future as opposed to being haunted by a lost future. Although there's obviously aspects of retrofuturism involved in this project. I mean, this is a 1970s model of what a space habitat would look like. This is kind of based on like a PlayStation 2 video game cover, you know. So there's aspects, of course, that are retrofuturist in this project.
Can one day we play the video game?
Sorry?
Can one day in the future we play the video game, or there are some plans to to the video game?
There's bits of the world animation that exists that you'll see tomorrow night. The hyperstition hasn't actualized. Yeah, it's only semi-actualized.
Yeah, and maybe it's like that the production of an image that becomes an organizational force to the future, maybe.
Yeah.
And in a certain way that deliver the future it presented, I think.
I mean, I should probably say that these images are created by simulation artist Lawrence Leck, who's probably most well known for this video essay, which I think is on YouTube, called Sinofuturism. He's exploring a lot of these ideas, thinking about Chinese science fiction and gaming worlds.
And the political moment right now in China.
Exactly. So again, I think there's a group of us kind of exploring these alternative futurities, both from inside Western history and outside Western history.
Last chance to the audience, no? Liliana?
Hello, thank you. It's just to share something and perhaps a question also. One is that I was listening and I was thinking about Drexia that happens in the sea and your Escapology that goes to the space, and I was thinking that it's like the Earth, it's like dumped, or it's so it's really you are creating spaces, or you are inhabiting in your sonic fictions spaces that are not the most obvious for us to live in. So I don't know if it says something to you, this comment, because
my hearing isn't so great, so I couldn't quite pick up a lot of what you said there.
So I need to speak louder, or it's a problem?
It's because the speakers are going out that way.
So if I speak like that, you...
I don't know, maybe I'll just calm down.
Okay, I will repeat like this. So I was just imagining, because I was wondering about your the image that I have now about, after listening you. It's that you spoke about this reference of the Drexia that happens in the sea, and you are now sending us to space. And I was like, and this and Earth, and the place where we, with our bodies, we inhabit this planet. So I was thinking, like, how do you? It's like if you invite the imagination to spread a little bit the sense of the body of what can be inhabit places that are not obvious at all. Or I don't know if you can say something about this or.
Yeah, I suppose that's the question of escapology, isn't it? How to spread the body-mind into what? Escapology is an idea like Houdini. He's all tied up in chains and he can wriggle about and escape this confinement. And I suppose that's where we are as a species. And so the question is, how do we get into the little bits of space that are there, speculatively, whether it be Drexia under the ocean, or how with the Drexian example, they take a line of flight from what was an attempt to kill them. And that's where the mutation comes in. They mutate under the ocean and develop the ability to survive under the ocean and thrive and proliferate and so on. So all of these escape routes involve some kind of anti-essentialist mutation that takes place, which is, I love this xenofeminist phrase, what is it? If nature is unjust, change nature, something.
By laboratório cubonics, no.
It's about, it's basically about not being confined by nature. And sometimes you need a science fictional mindset to break that kind of chain with the nature is determining. You need that science fictional conceit to what's that phrase? Nature is unjust, change nature. It's something like that.
Yes. Yes, it's something like
yeah. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Hey, wait, can you hear me? Yeah, I was thinking in the last few years since, I guess, the project first kind of floated off, there's been a lot of research into aliens reported both deep undersea and in outer space, both of those places being places that are unknown, but also places that are ripe for human exploitation. So in terms of looking at space as a relationship to the other and seeing how, I guess, the rich stay on Earth and the not so rich go up to space, how do you see that relationship in, I guess, the things that have changed in the present affecting the speculative future that you've created in the last few years?
How do I see that feeding back into the present?
Yeah.
This kind of speculative. Most literally with this project, and most literally and locally, I suppose it relates to what I mentioned earlier, which is it's probably more likely this scenario is going to unfold in fiction than it is in reality. In other words, it creates a myth. It creates, these kind of hyperstitional projects create a myth which may or may not take off. But if something is able to unravel and unfold and explore itself fictionally, while a practical its practical actualization is unlikely or impossible, then I suppose it's like running a simulation. When you run a simulation of something, you explore all the phase spaces in which that can actualize, and you create a preparedness for its actualization. So there's that dimension of it. Like, if it's unlikely to happen in political reality, then let's create a myth that is not chained by physical reality. A related aspect of that is I suppose, is to I think societies that feel trapped somehow do need functional myths to escape into in order to think about how to change the present. I'm not a big fan of the idea that when things being difficult in the present time being a reason to stop thinking about the future. I think that it makes thinking about the future more urgent somehow. I don't know if I'd want to pin down even more concretely how this project. I think my aspirations for this project are much more humble than them having some direct intervention into political reality right now. Yeah. It's more to create a functional myth in the absence of political change.
There is always a gap between the myth and the application of the myth.
There is, but in terms of how hyperstitions operate, that gap. I mean, this is a.
But I think that is the gap that is the operative dimension of the gap. The hyperstition.
Yeah, the tension of the gap is the engine of hyperstition, and the criteria of whether hyperstition works or not is a pragmatic criteria of whether it actualizes or not. You can't judge that in advance. I don't expect this. It's not a project of prediction. Like most interesting science fiction isn't predictive. It's more oblique or tangent, creating oblique refractions of the present in order to open a small place of speculative escapology. But yeah, this is how prophecies or the difference between hyperstition and prediction, I think, is to just send out probes into the future and then follow how the probes gestate and what congeals and how they spread and how they mature and disseminate and unfold and whether or not they actualize in some way. In a way, Hyperdub has operated in this way, which I didn't really expect, but it certainly operated, certainly started with some very bizarre short fictional excerpts that I wrote in round about 1999.
To the crew abstract, one of the fanzines of the crew, no. Abstract culture, no.
Yeah, there's aspects of the CCRU hyperstitions to do with this group called Hypersea, who are an Afro-Atlantean cult who are in this time war. In this time war with a white Western
Entity.
white magic cult that control the whole of Western history.
The Warwick chaos.
It's a long story. And so Hyperdub came out of a kind of like a kind of fictional offshoot from this bigger hyperstitional world. And has kind of somehow materialized over the last 20 years, 25 years actually, in a way that was very unpredictable and surprising.
Maybe it's a stupid question, but can you define the prefix hyper in hyperdub? Can you define the prefix hyper in the word hyperdub?
Why is the word hyper in hyperdub?
Is the same as hyperstition, is the same as hyper in terms of beyond the human, is the hyper in the terms of scale, or a kind of generalized dub?
All of those things, but more concretely, at the time it was just my way of making up a word to describe jungle. So it had the slow bass lines and fast rhythms. So it was my way of thinking about what jungle was as a musical singularity in the 1990s and how that reached back into this kind of Black Atlantean historic music history of the last, going back to, jazz and funk and dub and so on. So it's all of the things that you said and this other aspect.
Well, a last question. Well, Steve, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, sharing your imaginaries or futures or future abilities. Thank you.
Thanks for steering it in such a non-linear fashion.